All right. Hey everyone, and welcome to today's video. I'm going to be responding to a video called Overcoming Anxiety and Depression from a Christian Perspective. I'm just going to be offering, my thoughts and just analysis of this video, and I guess just a little bit of background information about myself in particular. But I guess just what's been going on with me a little bit. So there's a lot of videos that are out there on YouTube that I felt like I wanted to respond to, but then I never had much to say about it until I stumbled upon this video. It's been out for a while. It looks like he uploaded it. Let me see if there's a date when he uploaded it. I can't find it. I'm not seeing it. Anyway, he uploaded this a while ago, and like I said, I hadn't found a lot of material for me to respond to. I think the last video that I've actually responded to was Mike Winger, which he did a long time ago. So I wanted to do a little bit different take on this. So yeah, I stumbled upon this video, watched it, listened to it. I had listened to it previously, but then I listened to it again, and then just felt kind of more and more things on my mind that I wish or that I guess I had to say. Maybe offering just a different perspective currently from where or how I see things. Just to, I guess, more preliminaries in the sense that I'm not diagnosing anyone. I'm just taking the things that are said and drawing, obviously, conclusions from them, making evaluations off of them, things that I find, and trying to highlight things that I find problematic about this particular presentation about anxiety and depression. I guess, in some sense, what makes me qualified to do any of this. So I'm not a clinical psychologist. I don't consider myself a psychologist. My area of education was in undergraduate degree in childhood development, and then a graduate degree in applied behavior analysis, which is a subset of psychology. It's more stricter, I guess, in behavioral psychology. Nonetheless, though, so I am studying to be, if anything, I'm about to get ready to sit for taking my test to be a board certified behavior analyst. So essentially, I have the education, I have the degree, I just need to get the hours, clinical hours. So, but what does that have to do anything about anxiety and depression? Well, so it's in the field of psychology. Anxiety is something that I've looked into it myself, and I'm going to be drawing from so my perspective is going to be more behavioral. It's not going to really go into the mental processes, I guess, within anxiety, although there are mental processes that go involved, genetics, for example. What is going on privately within the individual. Now, obviously, I don't know Cameron and I don't know JP Moreland. I'm just going off of what they're telling and what they're saying and how they're kind of what it looks like to their audience, and how I kind of, like I said, I find some things problematic. Anyway, I'm not just pulling, this isn't just necessarily my opinion. This is just things that I have read about anxiety and what I've learned about it, and how I would help or apply it in some sense to other individuals. So I'm not just drawing it for myself. This is not just my opinion. If anyone does want to know more about where I'm getting any of this from, so right here is a behavior analytic, I'm going to show it in front of the screen, is a behavior analytic book called Acceptance and Commitment Therapy for Anxiety Disorders. So this is a practitioner's guide to using mindfulness, acceptance, and value-based behavior change strategies. So this is a behavior analytic tool or a research book on anxiety, but like I said, from a behavioral perspective. It's not going to be more from like a clinical psychological perspective. Another book I'm drawing from is called right here. It's a very good book, a resource. It's called Understanding Behavior Disorders, a contemporary behavioral perspective. This is, again, from a behavior analytic perspective, right? So behavior analysis, what it seeks to do, what it mainly seeks to do is things such as is to look at behavior, look at the environment, and how the environment is kind of operating on someone's behavior. So I'm going to be looking at things that happened before, happened during, and happened after, and then I kind of make an analysis about what's kind of governing the behavior or what's evoking that behavior, and bringing that to maybe one of my clients' attention to say, hey, look, and when these situation happens and this occurs, this is what tends to happen. This is what I see happening. This is what's functioning over your, this is possibly a function of your behavior, or what the stimulus, right? That's what we're going to probably call it, more technical term, how the stimulus is functioning over your behavior and how that's governing you. In some sense, I'm also looking at the way the individual is using language. So how someone may be using language, maybe like, I don't want to do this, I can't do this, and how that is influencing their behavior, and how the stimulus, and that, anyway, how that's influencing their behavior. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it. I'm not, like I said, diagnosing anyone. That's not my field. I don't do that. I am just looking at the behaviors that an individual does, looking at the environmental contingencies that are in place, and how that affects the likelihood of the individual either continuing to do a particular action or thing, whatever. And that's how I'll look at it. And so we look at it, of course, classically through, reinforcement punishment. So I'll be offering, like I said, just my perspective on this. Some things that I did find problematic and some things that I think are good in some sense. I guess before we start the video, what I do find pretty good about this is that I think mental health in general isn't really talked about a lot. And that's one thing that I think we should commend, people that are willing to be vulnerable in front of others, especially in front of a large crowd. Capturing Christianity, Cameron, he has, 147,000 subscribers at this point. And it's not easy to be in front of an audience and talk about your own experiences. It's a very vulnerable thing for anybody to do. So that's one thing. And the same thing for JP Moreland. And I think he's been more outspoken about his anxiety a lot lately. I mean, the reason why JP Moreland was on this was because he just recently published a book, I think, called Finding Quiet, Learning How to Handle Anxiety, Depression. Looks like that's kind of what the title is called. I have not read the book myself. I don't necessarily plan to read the book. I don't have any necessarily an interest. It's just my interest right now is just to see how this may be coming across, because there's also another video that Cameron has done mainly talking about anxiety and doubt and how it may be unjustified to have doubts in some sense. So that's a different video that we may go over if there's time. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say before we get started. I've watched this video multiple times. And so I will highlight some of the problems that I think are problematic. And yeah, we can go ahead and get started with this. Let me see. Let me just make sure the volume's up for you guys. Okay. Hopefully you guys will be able to hear it. Let me full screen this. Okay. Oh, you might hear my dog right there. All right, let's go ahead and get started.
Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. Today I've got Dr. J.P. Moreland with me. We're talking about anxiety and depression from a Christian perspective. Now, Dr. J.P. Moreland, he and I both have actually dealt personally with anxiety. Dr. Moreland, have you suffered from depression as well, or has it primarily been anxiety?
So right off the bat, Cameron lays out the topic. It's going to be about anxiety, depression. One of the things that I've noticed about this conversation that I kind of found a little frustrating or just I find problematic is that anxiety is really not defined within the discussion. It's talked about and we can kind of make judgments or inferences on what they mean by anxiety, but it's still kind of unclear about what they mean. People use anxiety in some sense, sometimes in like a pejorative sense, just how some people may exaggerate certain experiences that they have. Like for example, I'm not saying this is the case, but I'm saying something like, like, oh my gosh, I'm starving right now. When that they're just reflecting that they're just really hungry or that they're hungry. They're not in fact actually starving. So when someone says like, oh my gosh, my anxiety is kicking up right now. It's unclear about what they mean by anxiety. And I think when we're talking about mental health in this way, we need to be careful, or we should be careful, because we want to explicitly define what we mean by what we're saying. That way we all have a shared understanding, right? So in behavior analysis, we call this operationally, defining operational definitions of particular behaviors that we want to see. And we do this because if I write a definition about a particular observation or behavior that we're looking at. So maybe someone who is having aggression. Now I just said someone who's having aggression, but what does that actually mean? Can others look at the same aggression or look at aggression and without ambiguity within my definition? So I could say something like, we're going to track aggression hitting, or we're going to track aggression with this client because they're having high rates of aggression. Now, what does that actually look like if I were to pass it off to another clinician? They might look like, well, is this, what are we considering aggression? Are we considering just hitting aggression? Are we just considering verbal aggression? Are we considering throwing? Is that considered an act of aggression? So you have to be precise on what you mean by some of these terms, especially when it comes to things, like I said, mental health related issues or problems. So that's just kind of one of a problem. I have watched this multiple times. If they have defined it, then maybe I just have missed it. But I'm pretty sure they never really define what anxiety is. They just kind of talk about it. But we can kind of formulate an idea throughout the video about what they're actually meaning. Cameron talks about times when he has had anxiety, so we can kind of get an idea of something like that. So let's continue.
From depression as well. There are 7 different kinds of depression, and some of them are where depression causes anxiety, and there are others where anxiety causes depression. And I have that kind. My anxiety has tended to lead to depression. So yeah, I've had both.
Man, yeah, I've dealt with depression a couple times.
And that's too bad. You definitely you don't, it sucks. Definitely sucks feeling in the way or having that kind of experience. And definitely don't wish it upon anyone. And if you are suffering from anxiety or depression or things that are kind of getting in the way of that kind of living a valued life, definitely go seek help. Go talk to a professional, psychiatrist, whoever, counselor. I myself have done counseling. I recommend it. I'm a very big advocate for counseling. But obviously, it's one of those things where, if you need the help, go and seek that help. Yeah.
And it's been tied to certain like health issues, and I've been experiencing migraines a whole lot the last few months, and personal stuff like that, health issues, or tend to be the kind of thing that kind of kicks up my anxiety and at the worst parts of it, depression. But I did want to let people know that if you're watching this and you're interested in learning more about how to overcome your anxiety and depression, especially from a Christian perspective, Dr. Moreland has fairly recently published a book. Basically,
that's what I was going to say. I don't think I necessarily have any problem coming from a Christian perspective. Just like in counseling, you can have a Christian counselor, or someone that's gonna have that kind of perspective. I just haven't thought enough about it. I don't at the moment really see anything problematic with that. If you have a certain ideology about a particular thing, such as religion, or if you're a Christian and you want to go to a counselor that is kind of has that similar background, that may be fine. I don't necessarily see anything problematic with that. I have to think more about that. A really great resource that I used in the past, and I'll put links in the description, is through BetterHelp. So BetterHelp is a counseling website. They're not paying me for anything like this. I highly recommend it, where you can do a kind of survey right before. So like if you're looking into counseling and you go and you're like, okay, I would like a counselor, you can put what you are wanting to see a counselor for, and then you can put your preferences, if you want a male or a female, if you want someone older or younger, if you want someone from certain ideologies, so like a Christian or non-Christian. So like when I did counseling, I did something similar to that, where I highlighted why I wanted to be, or at least I highlighted the problems or the areas in my life that I felt needed work on. So I kind of selected those things. And then I put, someone from a non-Christian or non-religious background. I want someone who is not bringing that to the table, or won't be filtering things that I say through that lens. Someone's going to be filtering it through a different types of lens, one without religion. So like I said, I don't necessarily see anything problematic about it. I mean, at the end of the day, we're trying to live better lives. And, in some sense, if it helps, it helps. So
explaining his personal journey through anxiety and overcoming it. He's now, I think I can say, he's kind of on the other side of it, and so he's learned a whole lot.
That makes a point. So that's the first. So I want to highlight this real quickly, is that this is the first thing that, not that it's a red flag about anything, but it's very common, and there's a whole history behind this, and in the medical field, when it comes to health-related problems, is that we're seeing something like this, what Cameron just said, and there's going to be a theme about this, right, where he not only says things like overcome or control or avoiding, it's things like that is actually kind of the problem, right? In some sense, at least from the literature that I've been reading, right, anxiety isn't something necessarily to overcome, right? That's looking at it as like a kind of problem-based or medical-based or kind of like it's a symptom of something, right? And it's a symptom that needs to be alleviated, kind of in the same like if you had, a migraine, you're going to take a headache, you're going to take Tylenol because you have a symptom of something you're trying to avoid, and you're going to use Tylenol or something like that, ibuprofen, whatever, to get rid of that symptom. In the same way, we're trying to overcome a particular thing. Now, I would advocate for something more, and I'm not the only one doing this. So I'm going to be try to be very, very careful with this, is that when it comes to anxiety in this particular sense, viewing it as something to either overcome or as a symptom of your experience, that can be an unhelpful way of thinking about anxiety. A better way, or a more helpful way to think about anxiety, is that it's just another facet, right? Facet of the psychological or human experience, right? And we'll get into kind of, I think, Cameron's misconceptions about anxiety when we get a little deeper into it. But that's just kind of what I'm going to put that on the table right now, where it may not be a symptom of anything. It's just another experience that we have, and learning how to regulate it might be a better or more helpful way of looking at it. So maybe that's what Cameron means, is that, or maybe that's how JP Moreland means it, where it's like, hey, look, it's not that I've like necessarily overcome this, because I think Dr. Moreland says that he's still on some type of low prescription medication. But it's more of like he has a better way, he has learned better ways at managing it.
Okay. Through that process, talking with professionals and doing his own research, and I think the same is true for a lot of people who really take it seriously and want to get better. But I did want to let you know about his book. Unfortunately, I don't have a physical copy of it, but I do have it linked in the description of this video. It's called Finding Quiet: Overcoming Anxiety and Depression. I think the subtitle is just From a Christian Perspective. So I may have that wrong.
Okay, let me actually put this up at maybe 1.25 speed, because I've seen this multiple times. I'm going to get to the good stuff.
It's my story of overcoming anxiety and the practices that brought me peace.
Brought me peace.
Cool.
Okay, yeah. So I've got that book linked in the description of this video if you want to get it. Again, I have it on Kindle format, and I actually kind of like the Kindle format.
So this is something I definitely agree with Cameron. I have been reading books for a really long time, having actually the hard copy of it, and then I found that Kindle is actually very wonderful. So if you don't have a Kindle, I recommend doing Kindle.
You can actually see the popular highlights that other people have highlighted. So sometimes before I even read a book, I'll go and look at the popular highlights and kind of see what people have going on. But to kind of kick this off, I want to tell you some of the things that I've read in your book that have really helped me personally. So a little bit of background on me and on my story of anxiety is that a couple years ago, it was in 2019, I actually wound up in the hospital because I was experiencing my first panic attack, and I had no idea what was going on. I thought I was dying, my heart was racing, and I felt kind of flustered, and this would happen every few minutes as I was driving to work. And it turns out at the end, they checked out my heart, they checked out everything else, and I was completely normal, completely healthy. But at the time, I didn't know what I was experiencing. And so, but after that, from what I understand, after you have like your first panic attack, it's a whole lot easier to get panic attacks after that. But so after I experienced the first one, kind of figured out, okay, this is anxiety. Let me kind of get serious about this. I bought your book. I started to read through it. So one of the things that I read that kind of like was a game changer for me was just it was a term that you used that I learned, and it's catastrophizing. And so I wanted to get you to kind of give an overview of what that term means and how it might help people to overcome their anxiety.
Well, there are a lot of causes of anxiety, and perhaps we can go into that later. But one of the major causes is our self-talk, and these are kind of that we kind of talk to ourselves or see the world.
Okay, so I'm not sure. I mean, maybe he has this information. I'm not sure if that's actually really a major cause of anxiety, is the way that we're talking. But like I said in the beginning of this video, is that the way we actually do use language influences us and actually does affect us, right? So, and what he's going to go into is like catastrophizing, where you start thinking of these what ifs. Well, what if this is going to happen, and this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then your mind, or the way you're using language and the words that are and the thoughts that are being formulated, right? They're going to influence your behavior, right? In this sense, it sounds like most of the time it's going to be some type of avoidant behavior. You're just not going to engage in a particular action or aversive event that you think is going to actually happen. Okay, so going back to what Cameron had said, he had said, I'm losing track of it. ways that he had helped. Okay, so with anxiety, the problem is that because it's still ill-defined, we still don't really have an understanding of what anxiety is. He says that he was having anxiety on the way to work. At least, so we're actually almost 4 minutes into the video. We still don't really know what he means by anxiety, but he says that he was having it on the way to work, possibly due. It sounds like from what he has admitted that, and then later on in the video he admits that there was a lot of stress going on at work if he didn't know he was going to lose his job or not. So that was causing some anxiety to be evoked. Okay, so the problem is, a little bit, as I see it, is that everyone has anxiety about things, right? I have anxiety. I can say that I have anxiety right now, right? What am I going to say? How am I going to say it? Is this going to bother a bunch of people? Am I actually doing more harm than good? So things like that are on my mind. But you can have two people, right, where both experience the same anxiety, both experience anxiety. But why is it, right? This is kind of like the $1 million question. Why is it that some people can have anxiety where it never becomes pathological, and people can and then on the other side, you have people that have anxiety or develop anxiety, whatever the case, they have anxiety, and it becomes pathological to where it becomes debilitating to their life. Why is that the case? Because anxiety, as we'll kind of talk about it when it gets brought up, is actually very adaptive. Having anxiety or learning, getting at the heart of anxiety, which is kind of more fear-based, actually, fear conditioning learning or for fear learning, that's highly adaptive for an individual. So why is it that people can experience fear and anxiety and it never becomes a problem? And in fact, people can have panic attacks in the way that Cameron just described, and it never becomes pathological. It never becomes such it never affects their life in such a way. And right, that's not just my opinion. Right. So I just want to be clear. That's not just me saying that. It's probably it's also within some of the research where people can have a panic attack and they'll never have another panic attack. Now, what's probably the case, and what may be the case from what I'm reading, is that people can develop panic attacks, or when they have their first panic attack, it seems like they probably could start having more panic attacks because they are trying to control their experience. They're trying to avoid that experience. They're trying to do everything that they can to avoid which in the literature is called experiential avoidance. So they'll do something, right, to avoid those triggers, to avoid the experience of feeling whatever they may be feeling, because it's very unpleasant. I've never had a panic attack myself, but from what Cameron describes, it sounds very, very unpleasant. And it makes sense, right, why an individual will want to avoid that. Right. So again, this is just me looking at the things that he's saying and what he did, and then drawing some inferences and conclusions about what may be occurring. So it sounds like that's what's happening, right? He had an experience and he didn't want to experience it again. And so and then now what they're going into is part of the role of that language plays, right? And this part that it can become, these very maladaptive or pathological thought patterns where you're just catastrophizing about the experience. And you catastrophize it enough to where you just simply avoid the trigger or the stimulus that could be evoking the experience of fear or anxiety, however you want to cash that out.
And they become such a habit that we're not even aware that we're talking to ourselves in that manner. And so in the book, Finding Quiet, I list 10 thought distorters or 10 profoundly unhelpful ways of talking to yourself. And one of them is called magnification or catastrophizing. And this actually is the one that I do most. I don't do it much anymore, but this is one of the things that in my life I had to try to overcome. And it involves the following. You do a lot of what ifing. What if this happens? And then you catastrophize it. That means that you think about the worst case scenario. So you go, oh my gosh, what if this happens? That's going to be devastating. And then you spend all your time obsessing on how to protect yourself from that thing happening, because if it does, you're dead. And so magnification or catastrophizing is blowing something up to be bigger than it really is.
Yeah, and we definitely all do this, right? Where, I've done this in the past, but it doesn't become pathological, right? So it's not just exclusive to anxiety. I've done this when I just don't want to do something, where maybe, my family would want to, or my wife is wanting to go to an event, and I'm like, well, I don't want to go to the event. I'm going to feel this way, and I don't want to do this. And then if this happens, and this happens, it just depends on the function, right? At least that's how I'm going to look at it. It depends on the function of the behavior. Why am I doing this particular thing? Am I trying to avoid it? That's one thing. As far as what JP Moreland said about thought distortions, right? So cognitive distortions is something that's commonly talked about some in the literature within at least cognitive behavioral therapy, where people have these distorted views, which I mean you can look at them as fallacies as well. But yeah, so catastrophizing is one of them. I think emotional reading or mind reading is another one. There are many different types of thought distortions, but pretty much they're just kind of common fallacies that people think about the things. It could be another one, could be a thought distortion of some type of like hasty generalization, but these are cognitive biases, right, that we have. I definitely agree that once you become aware of something that you're doing, right? Hey, I'm catastrophizing right now, or hey, I'm just mind reading right now. Maybe I should, ask this person why they did what they did instead of me trying to, assume the worst intentions of the individual. And that's something that I definitely have a problem with myself, where I'm mind reading people, and sometimes I'm wrong. I would say maybe majority of the time I'm wrong. It's kind of unclear at that point, but the fact that I'm doing it, I can start to identify when I'm doing it and then just ask for clarification. So definitely thought distortions is very common within the literature of cognitive psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy. So let's keep going.
And I think one thing we have to learn is the ways to take the power out of those possible events or even actual events if they've happened.
So how would you recommend that we start to do that? How would we get to that point of being able to recognize? So one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of
How would you get to do that? I mean, my first thought is maybe go seek a professional. Go seek a counselor, especially if it's becoming a huge problem and hindrance in your life.
these what if worst case scenarios, in reality, it's like, I mean, it's possible. A lot of these possibilities are indeed possible, but that doesn't mean at all that it's probable or that you should be spending most of your time worrying about that one thing coming about. So how can we kind of overcome that? What I've also noticed, let me just add this in here really quickly, is that anxiety is kind of like a loop. It's like a train that you can't get out, you can't exit. So it's like a train that just goes in a loop and a loop and a loop. And so once you get on the train, you can't get off, or it's not easy to get off. And it just, it's continually perpetuating the cycle of anxiety. It just makes it worse and worse and worse. It can develop into depression, like you mentioned earlier. So yeah, how do we get?
And that's definitely true, right? Where you may be thinking, I think here's a kind of a good metaphor, or a metaphor that I can pull up right now. But it's something like, let's say you're trying to get to a destination, right? You're trying to get to the mountain, right? Let's say you're trying to, or wherever you're trying to go, and you start having anxiety. So you take a quick hop, right? You take go to the rest stop or something like that, or you take a break from it because something's maybe causing your anxiety trigger. But then you just kind of stay there, right? You're just going around and around in a loop, and you never get back to your destination. So that's one way I also look at how anxiety is. But there's nothing. I don't think there's anything wrong with Cameron's metaphor. It definitely seems like that could be the case, and that seems like it is the case. With people who are on the anxiety train loop, as Cameron says. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that he had said that I wanted to comment on. I don't think so. Let's keep going.
That train of depression, and how can we get better?
Well, you
Get better. Okay, yeah. I mean, my recommendation is going to see a professional.
really said it well, and you're right on both counts. I think you have to realize that you're not going to get well by osmosis. I mean, you can't just sit around and do nothing and expect to get better. So you have to take charge of things, independence on the spirit. And what I mean by that is that you always have a heart.
Again, so right here, I don't necessarily have a problem with this. Dr. Moreland, or JP Moreland, he's just going to be going through his perspective from a Christian perspective. Obviously, that's what the title is. So I may just skip over this part. I don't really find it that useful, but it could be useful for others.
Openness to promptings or direction, or
I think this is good advice, though, generally.
And so it's a co-laborship where you work together with God. But one of the first things you have to do is to learn to spot when you're engaging in negative self-talk. And so you invite the Spirit every morning, Psalm 139, to search you and know you and examine you, and to see if there is a harmful way inside of you, so that you don't go scuba diving into your own self by alone. You always take the Spirit with you, and you ask Him to help you become aware of when you're catastrophizing or doing other thought distorters. Now, once you notice that you're doing this, then I think what you have to do is you have to stop and say, wait a minute, this is just a habit I'm in. This doesn't have anything to do with reality. This thing that I'm anticipating that's going to be happening, 94%, according to studies, of things that people do what-ifing on never happen. And so the chances of what I'm worrying about happening are very, very small. And
I mean, obviously, I'm going to probably say like citation needed. I'm not sure about that study. I have no idea what that study is. I have no idea what it's called. So maybe I'll look it up and figure out if that actually is the case. Um, yeah, so I'm not sure about that. I don't know how that would be um, measured. Maybe they're doing self-report or something like that. Anyway, that's just a comment I have on that.
If they do happen, they're almost always not as catastrophic as one thinks they are. So what you have to do is you have to say, this thing that I'm what ifing and I'm just thinking it's going to be horrible is not related to a reasonable prediction of the future, but instead it's a really bad coping strategy. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it aside for a minute, and I'm not going to keep obsessing on this, and instead I'm going to turn to something and focus on it that gets me caught up into what's called flow. And flow is when you're wrapped up in something to where you kind of lose track of time. You're so interested in it. So when I was went through my second nervous breakdown.
Okay, so I'm going to stop here just because before he gets talking about what he means by flow, I haven't actually heard that term before, prior to him saying it, but it sounds like some type of mindfulness in some sense. But again, so we're about 8 minutes, 9 minutes in, and what he's saying is that, let's just go back over what JP Morgan said. 94% of people, what they what if about never really comes to happen. And if they do what if about it, and it does happen, it's not nearly as bad as they said. Okay, so again, this is kind of the problem, right? When they haven't defined what we even mean by anxiety. Because like I said, there's a healthy form of anxiety, and then there's a non-healthy form of it, right? When does it become pathological? And they haven't really stated when it would become pathological and when it is actually a good thing, right? I have a test coming up back in 2 months. Not 2 months. Let's see, at the beginning of February. Okay, and that is for me to sit for the board, and become a officially board certified behavior analyst. If I don't study for this, and this is actually true, if I don't study for this test, and I take the test, I could fail it, right? That is a what if. And that's true, right? Now, I'm not sitting here obsessing about it, but if I'm not proactive about studying it, I'm going to fail that test. Okay, that seems pretty healthy to do. That seems like very likely to happen. That's a very reasonable thing. Now, if I said, okay, if I don't fail this test, then maybe it's the end of the world. I'm just going to be, X, Y, and Z. Now that's maybe a little bit more starting to go into the catastrophizing aspect of language. But just simply thinking, oh my gosh, if I don't study for this test, it's going to be coming up in 3 to 4 months. If I don't study for it, I'm going to fail it. That gives me some anxiety right now. So what do I do? What do I do with that? Well, maybe I start doing things that are proactive about it. All right, that sounds like a very healthy form of an adaptive form of anxiety. So it's very unclear, at least what JP Moreland's mind is, that when would it become pathological? This is a good question for him. When does he think it'd be pathological and when it would not? And maybe this isn't even the best question for him because he's not a doctor. He's not a psychologist. He's not a psychologist. He's not a psychiatrist, as far as to my knowledge. Maybe he is. I don't think so. But that would be it. That's something to think about. And so that's kind of the problem that I have, that they still haven't defined it. The second thing is that with flow, it depends on how you're using flow. So I'm going to rewind it a little bit, let him go what he means by flow, and then look at how I think it sounds like he may be using it as a tool to help him alleviate some of that anxiety. So let me rewind it.
I'm going to turn to something and focus on it.
Let me go back.
So what I'm going to do is not related to a reasonable prediction of the future, but instead it's a really bad coping strategy. And so what I'm going to
stop right there. Real quick, I agree that it is a bad coping strategy, but again, you have to demarcate why would it be a bad coping strategy and when does it become a good coping strategy, right? So think about it like this. When again, this is part of my frustration where they have not really clearly defined or have clearly talked about what they mean by anxiety and how is it related to fear. Okay, so I guess I haven't either. So let me just try to give a little bit more background information. What is it about fear that makes it adaptive for us? Okay, so in some sense, fear is learned and fear can be unconditioned, right? So fear is learned in the sense of there's a classical experiment that was done about the conditioning of fear with this little boy named Albert. Anyone who's probably taken an undergrad in psychology will learn about how this can be come about. Okay, so We know that fear can be learned, right? It can be conditioned. And how they set up the experiment was actually very cruel. And hopefully this is never done again. But what they did was they had a little boy, like a toddler, I think, in a room, and they brought out this like rat or mouse, like kind of think of like the little white mouse that they have. They had him play with it, engage with it. He was not afraid of it. He was engaging with it. And what they started doing is that every time what they did was that they started pairing the presentation of the mouse with a very loud sound, and the loud sound would scare him or it would startle him. Okay, so what they did that over and over and over again till they found that anytime without even, they conditioned Albert to just by seeing the rat, he didn't want it to engage with it. He didn't want to touch with it. Okay, so fear, from a very cruel experiment, learned that fear is conditioned. But what is fear, though? Fear is a present-based emotion actually, let me give you a technical definition, or not a technical definition, but let me give you a definition, which is something like: fear is a present-oriented state that occurs in response to real or imagined danger or threat. Some of these threats are present in the here and now, a situation that is dangerous or distressing. Others are in response to what is going on inside the client, ergo a disturbing physical sensation, a thought, or a memory of the past, and some are a combination of these things. So that's what fear is, and fear is highly adaptive. It gets someone out of the way of a particular threat or danger, right? And so here's an example. Imagine someone who was, abused either sexually or emotionally, or just came from a really bad either upbringing from a particular individual, or raped, whatever the case, something very, very, very psychologically traumatic happening to this individual. Now they grow up or maybe years, some time passes, and now they come in contact once again with that abuser or the person that did that traumatic event. What does that person do? Well, you're gonna have some physiological arousal, right? Some type of like fight, flight, or freeze kick in. They're gonna avoid the situation. Fear is going to be evoked, right? So you're gonna have fear that's evoked, and they're gonna move away. They're gonna run away. Possibly they're gonna fight. They're gonna leave. They're gonna tell their friends. Whatever the case, they're gonna do something about it. That is a highly adaptive emotion and a highly adaptive function, right? For an individual to leave the threat or the potential of the threat, of the threat. Okay, now when does it become kind of problematic? Well, it could become problematic when that's being generalized to everyone or to everything, to where they start avoiding everyone, any contact, right? Now we're starting to get into an area of discrimination between, here is something that has been adaptive and is adaptive and a very reasonable response and perhaps a rational response. And then it can become problematic when you start doing that to every single one, where you're not even in a threatful situation. You're in a different environment, you're with different people, and you're in a safe environment, quote unquote, where that won't happen. And you're still having those same physiological arousal or responses. That is probably, from what I've read in the literature, is when it starts becoming pathological, or when it starts becoming maladaptive. And because of you're wanting to avoid, or because the individual will be having those arousals and they're wanting to avoid situations, that gets in the way of living a meaningful life or the things that they value, right? So here is, I feel that is something that needs to be discussed, and I wish it was discussed in this video, although I think he probably should have just had a professional on. I know he's probably wanting to have JP Moreland on to promote his book. That's besides the point. But another thing, okay, going back a little bit, what is emotional regulation? Okay, so we all regulate our emotions in some sense, right? If you're angry, you're going to regulate your emotions. You're going to have some self-control. The problem, again, is that you have coping skills that we have developed. The way in which the way in which emotional regulation starts to become a type of dysregulation or pathological or maladaptive is when your emotions need not be regulated, right? Now, look at that in the sense with anxiety, right? Does having anxiety in a specific context need to be regulated? Sounds like sometimes it may not be, sometimes it can be, sometimes you should, maybe you shouldn't, right? So that goes on to what, in some sense, I'm in agreement, like I said, with JP Moreland, where it is just a unhelpful way of coping with life. But again, when you haven't really defined or clearly identified what we're talking about, and we're just having some vague guesses, it makes it hard to either A, talk about it meaningfully, or have someone like myself or anyone else listen to this and be like, well, it's unclear what he means.
set it aside for a minute, and I'm not going to keep obsessing on this. And instead, I'm going to turn to something and focus on it that gets me caught up into what's called flow. And flow is when you're wrapped up in something to where you kind of lose track of time. You're so interested in it. So when I went through my second nervous breakdown, and I've had one in 2003, lasted 7 months, and 2013 that lasted 5 months. And in the first one, I had my first panic attack, and like you, I had no idea what was happening to me. It was horrible, and I was having them daily, to be honest. But what I learned to do was to catch when I was engaging in some kind of triggering self-talk that triggers those emotions. And they're doggone it so hard because they're habits, Cameron, and that's what makes it difficult. But you have to start somewhere, and you'll get better and better and better at it. But then you label it and say, this is nothing but emotional reading, and I have 10 different kinds. You try to find the one that helps you, and you put a label on it. And then you say, I'm gonna play solitaire for a while, or I've got a novel I'm gonna read, or I'm a Chiefs fan. I'm going to check what's been going on with the Chiefs or whatever it might be, or do something that works for you. And it doesn't have to be spiritual. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. It could be anything that will get your mind on something else for, say, 5 to 10 minutes. And
so I'm going to look at this from a different perspective. I'm coming from more of a behavioral perspective. So traditionally, that seems right about maybe a general advice that maybe a clinician or a counselor would give the individual, like, hey, you know what, notice when you're starting to have these thought patterns, or you're going back into these thought patterns, try to refocus your mind on something else. I find it maybe inconsistent of JP Moreland to say that you can't do something out of sheer will. I think he says, I don't know if he said it or maybe he will say it. He does say it, something that you can't just will yourself to do a particular thing. But, I'm just thinking about someone who, if you've experienced obsessive thoughts before, and you try to, here, I'll just give an example. When it's really loud, right? And you're trying to read, it's very, very difficult to focus on reading when you have just an environmental stimulus that is just bombarding your experience. It's very hard through sheer will. So it's kind of, now take that analogy and put it to something like intrusive thoughts or obsessive thoughts that are just there and they keep going and they're not stopping. How can you just through sheer will, or what sounds like focusing on something else is going to do that? It's kind of unclear. Maybe that does happen. I'm not sure. My second thing is that the thing is that how I'm looking at it is that it depends on why you're doing that, right? If you have obsessive intrusive thoughts and you engage in a particular activity to get rid of those thoughts or to regulate those thoughts or to alleviate those thoughts, I think that's from what the literature is saying, is that at least from this perspective, the acceptance and commitment perspective, that is part of the problem. You're trying to control the experience. You're trying to control the thoughts when they need not be controlled. Why not just sit with the experience or try to sit with the experience and learn to just accept it, right? And acceptance is very, I don't mean it just like giving up sense. I mean, there's a term called radical acceptance within the psychology. And this is just looking at the experience and being with the experience in a non-judgmental way, right? And this is hard for a lot of people. It's hard for myself. And especially when you have unpleasant feelings, because we're kind of psychologically hardwired to avoid aversive events and to move towards pleasant events, right? But it's very difficult. We're not trained, right, as individuals, as humans, right, to sit with those experiences in a non-evaluative way. And the problem is that's when you have the role of language, where the way we're using language, makes those evaluations upon that experience, right, instead of just learning to sit with the experience. So studies have shown, though, and this is, again, through this literature here that I'm showing you, or I'll show you one more time, through this book, is that sitting with the experience, what they call, just learning to accept the experience in a non-judgmental way. I'm not trying to be very careful here. I'm not just meaning like in a giving up way. I'm not meaning as like trying to avoid it or just accepting this is just how I am. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that when you have the experience, we can't control the experience. What we can control is how we respond to that experience. But the experience itself sometimes need not be controlled. And that's part of the problem. And so what we want to do, or what maybe could be what someone may be recommending, or what I guess I'd recommend, is something more of like learning just to sit with the experience and just feel it, and in a non-judgmental and a non-evaluative way. And when you notice your thoughts starting to make an evaluation, something as what JP Moreland said was like label it, or just notice it, and that's just another experience, right? So the main focus here is that at least this practice, the using ACT or acceptance and commitment theory, is not about the content of the it's not about the content of the experience, right? And that's what they're kind of focusing on a lot. And this is why I think Cameron has some misguided views on emotional regulation. Sorry, not emotional regulation, anxiety and doubt, because he's looking at it from a cognitive content experience. Or sorry, the way he's using language. Because he's using language, I think, is because he's and this isn't the only one. This is a very tradition, right, where cognitive behavioral therapy focuses on the content of what the person's saying, how they're saying it, how it affects them. What ACT is wanting to do, acceptance commitment therapy is wanting to say, is that that's part of the problem. We're not going to focus on the content of what the person is saying. It may be true or false. What we're going to focus on is developing behavioral skills to how we respond to those experiences. And we're not going to argue with ourselves. We're not going to try to change that content. We're going to sit with the content. We're going to allow the experience to happen. And because we can't change that experience, all we can change is how we respond to it.
After you practice this for a while, you only need to do it for a minute or two because you form the habit of going there immediately.
What I was going to say is that if your intention is to do these things, trying to get into a state of flow, however JP Moreland mentions it, to avoid the thoughts, again, from looking at it behaviorally, you're just reinforcing the experiential avoidance aspect, which is part of the problem, right? And that's what, we're wanting to avoid a lot of these things, and we're just essentially using some type of negative reinforcement.
And so it doesn't take as long. So what you do is you focus and get wrapped up, and the power of this thought goes away. What you can then do is return to the thing that you're magnifying. Oh my gosh, what happens if this test comes back and I've got cancer, or whatever it might be? And then you're able to actually think about it for a bit without it being troublesome, because you've sort of taken the power out of it.
Let me speed it up a little bit.
Obsessing. And so I think then you can just remind yourself that this is not something that you need to be worried about, because it's a habit. Now, you can't just will yourself to stop thinking about these things.
Okay, there we go. Will yourself. But again, I feel like that's kind of inconsistent. I mean, someone can still have obsessive thoughts and try to will themselves to, do other things. I don't know. It just seems, reflecting on my own experience, that's a very, very hard thing to do through sheer will. But
what you can do is practice this 4-step solution, which I have in the book, of noticing it, kind of labeling it, refocusing away from it, and then coming back to it and kind of assessing how you did. And if you do that for a period of time, like forming any habit, getting good at the piano or whatever it might be, you will begin to find that you're doing it habitually. And that's the way to break the cycle. Because if you try to break the cycle without taking baby steps and habit-forming practices, you're going to make the cycle worse.
So he's saying that pretty much, from what I'm gathering, is that you have a thought pattern or something that's habitual. What you want to do and how you break the cycle, right, is through forming other habits that are going to counteract that habit. I'm not sure about that. I do think that's probably part of the problem, is that you're trying to counteract something like an experience like that. I'll have to think a little bit more about that. Because it seems to me what you're doing fundamentally, right, is you're developing habits to avoid certain experiences, because those experiences are unpleasant. And that seems to be part of the problem.
Because what we've learned is that if you obsess on something, it causes the grooves in your brain that trigger anxiety without you choosing it to go deeper, and they become ruts, and they're harder to get rid of. So that's why you want to try to figure out a way to break that cycle, and this is how you do it.
Yeah, there's a few things that I wanted to touch on that you mentioned there. One of them was the idea of triggers, and I noticed that is a big one that's really helped me a lot, is identifying the triggers that cause anxiety for you. So for me, one of my biggest triggers at the beginning was, because my anxiety is typically just related to my health issues, which I don't really have many serious health issues, but that's what anxiety is. That's the second thing I wanted to touch on, was how anxiety seems to be enemies with reason. But let me get back to this idea of triggers, is that for me...
That's because I think Cameron thinks that because he's focusing on the content of the anxiety rather than the experience on the anxiety. If you focus... So I'm not going to accept something like that where it's enemies with reasons, quote unquote. And I think I have the reasons for is that because anxiety is adaptive. Having anxiety is adaptive, and that it still hasn't been defined. So let me give you another definition of what anxiety typically is being said within the literature. Is something like anxiety, by contrast, is a future-oriented mood state that is accompanied by anxious apprehension, worry, increased muscle tension, restricted peripheral automatic arousal, and marked increases in EEG, beta activity, reflected intense cognitive processing in the frontal lobes, right? So it's future-oriented. Fear is present. Anxiety is future. It's still not clearly defined within this video. And the problem is that if Cameron wants to say that it's enemies with reason, however, you could still use reason and have anxiety. So I'm thinking of like, again, like me studying for my test. There is nothing unreasonable or irrational or about me having a worry about that. If I don't study, I'm going to fail. Now, it's and this is what I mean, where it's been undefined by him to where he could still say, well, I agree with that, but he means it in a different way. Well, that's fine, but you have to say it rather than just making this blanket statement that anxiety is enemies with reason, when it sounds like it's more like pathological anxiety or some type of debilitating anxiety or anxiety disorder, however you want to cash that out, is and it can be enemies with reason. Excuse me.
It was Googling my symptoms. I would get on Google and I would start to research my symptoms. And Google is set up in a way such that it's going to make you click on the thing that it wants you to click on, or the thing that you're most likely to click on. And what are the things that people are most likely to click on? I want to know if I have cancer. I want to know if I have like this really bad thing. And so most of the top results that you get, no matter what your symptoms are, you got pain in your chest, you got pain in your side, you got pain in your leg, that seems weird, out of place, or just like happened randomly, you got cancer. That's what Google is going to tell you. Or you've got some serious untreatable condition. And so for me, identifying that was what was triggering my anxiety, because I would like stay on Google at the very beginning of my anxiety issues. And so identifying that trigger for me, removing it and replacing it with something better, something different, was what really started to help me get out of that rut. And as you said, it's not this thing like you don't just change that behavior one or two times and then you're good to go. So I wouldn't suggest, if you're going through anxiety right now about something, doesn't matter what it is, don't think that like, okay, I replaced this bad habit a couple times today, therefore your anxiety is done, or that you're going to be on the other side of it. To me, what I've noticed for me is that if I'm going through really serious anxiety symptoms, then it normally takes a few days at least.
So there it is right there. Anxiety symptoms. Symptoms of what? It's just another experience
of actively noticing what my triggers are and avoiding those triggers for my anxiety.
There we go again. Avoiding the triggers, avoiding the experience, right? Okay. This is through what Cameron's saying. He has triggers that there are some things in the environment triggers the behavior of anxiety, the physiological, the private events, the physiological sensations, whatever the case, however he wants to describe it. What does he do? He avoids it, right? That is now he is what we're going to say, or what I would say is that he is now negatively self-reinforcing himself to avoid particular triggers, to avoid the psychological experience of anxiety. And when you look at it from that kind of perspective, it is a psychological process. It is an experience, right? That is a non-cognitive type of process, right? It's a psychological process. It's not irrational, or, I mean, it doesn't seem like that's going to be under the guise of rationality, right? So if it's a non-cognitive process, then it's kind of hard to clearly say that it's an enemies with reason, right? Especially it's like, how is a non-cognitive process enemies with reason when it's not reason? You're not using a cognitive process. And I think that's just the mistake. And it's not just, I don't think it's, I'm just harping on Cameron right now a little bit because obviously he has an audience. He is putting forward some ideas that I think are potentially problematic, especially in this kind of avoidance type of way. Uh-oh.
To like sort of get back to normal. So that's, I wanted to comment on that.
Uh-oh, did I lose my stream? Let me see. May have lost my stream. Are we good? Okay, thanks, we're good. Okay.
The idea of triggers doesn't have to be health stuff, could be anything. I get a lot of people actually who reach out to me saying that they get anxiety genetics. They get anxiety about philosophy.
It was clipped there, but I think he says that he gets anxiety about people message him and saying that he gets anxiety about they get anxiety about apologetics or philosophy. I mean, that's kind of unknown to me that people would get anxiety about apologetics. Maybe they start thinking that they need to know things. I know I definitely have those insecurities at times, right? Where it's like, oh my gosh, like, how am I going to respond to this person? Or what am I going to say to this person? Because I don't feel like I know enough. So Again, though, it's unclear, and this goes back to what I said earlier. It's that people use it in kind of in a pejorative way. Well, I get anxiety about X, Y, and Z, just like, in some sense, like, oh my gosh, I'm so starving right now, where they're using language in this an exaggerated type of way when maybe it's not pathological or maybe it's okay. Anyway, it's just we're at 14 minutes in. We still haven't heard a really definition of anxiety from this video.
What if God doesn't exist? And I'm sure that on the other side, if I was an atheist, I get people reaching out to me. What if hell is real? What if other things? So it can happen that your triggers can be all sorts of different things. But let's talk a little bit about triggers and how we can kind of combat these triggers, because I think that's super important for overcoming anxiety, and maybe the different types that there are and ways that you can start to overcome those. And then I want to return to this idea that anxiety is enemies with reason. I think that is really, really powerful once you can really get that deep into your brain.
Yeah, so I'm just going to reject that. I don't think it is enemies with reason because, for one, they haven't defined what anxiety is. Anxiety is actually adaptive. Anxiety is adaptive. And they have to differentiate it, which they have not done. And I've tried to do a little bit, where you have to differentiate between when anxiety is a normal, healthy anxiety versus a non-healthy related way where it becomes pathological, where, yes, it could go into the realm of enemies with reason. But again, it's not. That's because, at least from my estimation, from what it sounds like, is that Cameron is focused, just like a lot of the cognitive behavioral therapists have been focusing on the content of what the person is saying rather than just trying to but respond to the actual experience, right?
Because you think that it's rational. You think that what you're going through is, okay, these are all reasonable possibilities. This is reasonable. I need to prepare myself for this.
Again, he's focusing on the content, right? When I'm going to cash that out in a different way, or the behavior analysis, or from the behavioral psychologist, or from an acceptance, from the acceptance and commitment therapy perspective, no one's going to focus on that. We're just going to say, okay, cool. Now how do you feel? Using some type of techniques, right, to help reshape the experience, not reshape the experience. That's not what I'm saying. To help sit with the experience, right, in a non-evaluative way.
But as you said, 94% studies show that 94% of the things that we worry about never happen. So no, it's probably not reasonable. But let's return to that in a second. Let's talk about triggers for a little while.
Right. Well, I'm just going to make some assertions here. But
I appreciate that JP Moreland wants to say that he's just going to make assertions here. So I just probably going to skip over this because he starts talking about the soul, and obviously I don't think the soul exists. So I appreciate him just saying assertions.
The reason your thoughts and your conscious life are in your soul and not in your brain. Your brain doesn't contain memories any more than a CD contains music. Traumatic experiences in the past where you have stuffed it and you've never properly allowed that. Now, a couple on something, which then will produce anxiety. Now, a trigger might cause you to start obsessing on something, which then will produce anxiety. But that's essentially what a trigger is. It kind of tends to be something outside of your control directly. Now, a couple of different major triggers are either traumatic experiences in the past where you have stuffed it and you've never properly allowed that to be experienced and healed, because that's a very frightening thing to do.
Sure.
And the other kind of trigger is not so much an event or episode that is embedded, stored in your brain at a deep level, but rather bad habits of coping with fear that we have developed over time.
There we go.
Cameron, one of the things that...
There we go. I felt like that's pretty good information right there. It is bad way of coping with fear, right?
Learned. And it's so important for people to get this if they get nothing else. And here it is, that for the most part, anxiety is a learned habit that can be unlearned with the proper practices. And so you can have bad habits at golf or playing a musical instrument or doing penmanship or whatever the activity may be. And what you have to do is to practice certain ways of writing or playing the scales or whatever it might be to replace those triggering grooves with healthy grooves that trigger an automatic, a nice way to write the English letters when you're writing, or trigger feelings of peace and joy instead of fear and anxiety. And so habit formation, or getting in touch with episodes early in one's life that were traumatic in one way or another, are a couple of ways of dealing with different kinds of triggers that are very, very important. And they are thought distorters. They are not rational. But they feel like you're really on top of it when you're having one, because you think, man, I'm focused in, and I'm really thinking this thing through. And the truth of the matter is that you're distorted, and you're living in a reality that's not real. And you think you're mastering this thing, but you're actually making it worse.
I like that a lot. Let's talk a little about cognitive behavioral therapy because I've never actually done it myself, but in my research I've learned some of the methods and things that they use, and I think
I think that's kind of the problem, right? I mean, it's kind of hard for me to realize that some people haven't heard about cognitive behavioral therapy, because I feel like I've heard about it for a really long time now. Um, anyway, that's just a side comment. Really, nothing meant by that.
it's kind of based on this idea that if you can change the behavior that you're engaging in, which the behavior could be something like I was mentioning earlier with myself and looking at Google, searching symptoms on Google, that's the behavior, that's the trigger that leads to more and more anxiety. That's the kind of thing that gets me in the loop, anxiety. But if you change the behavior, as you mentioned, and there's a couple ways that you can do that, and let's maybe talk about that. One of the ways that I found that's really helped me, first of all, you got to recognize what your trigger is, and then
I think if he, never mind. Let's just keep going. Sorry.
recognize that, then you can start to take steps and to avoid those and to change the grooves in your brain and neuroplasticity, all of that stuff. Very scientific, very real. You can change your habits if you actually put some effort into it. So one of the ways that one of the things, and this is going to be more practical. One of the things that I've done that's really helped me sort of get out of these anxiety loops once I get into them, and I notice I'm starting to learn more and more when I get into them. But one of the things I do is I cause myself physical pain somewhere, and that might sound a little strange, but it's like the one thing that consistently works for me. So what I'll do is I'll usually just like pinch myself in the leg, pinch myself in the arm, and what happens is that I don't really know exactly what happens in the brain, but I can tell you what my experience is. My experience is that all of the like the loop of anxiety that I'm currently in, worrying about all these different things, my brain can no longer think about those things because I've got some physical pain somewhere, and that's where all of my thought goes.
Okay, so I do not recommend anyone to do this. I'm not sure he may have found this on Google. Sounds like he probably did. If he did, since he's doing research with it, and he mentioned that he goes on Google. So I'm just going to make that a little inference. I'm assuming that's probably where he found it from. I do not recommend anyone doing this. You're inflicting pain upon yourself to get yourself out of a certain experience. What Cameron is doing, it sounds like, right? Again, here's the theme here. He's trying to control the experience. He's trying to alleviate the symptoms of something that may not need to be alleviated. He, instead of just allowing himself to feel the anxiety and to not judge it, just to be in the anxiety and sit with the anxiety, right? So here's another example that I'm going to try to hit with you guys. Maybe this will be helpful. Okay, so here's, this isn't my example. I'm ripping from a psychologist, all right? So I'm going to use the example, just kind of change the wording. So just like when you have the experience of anxiety or experience a very unpleasant feeling, I want you to look at it like this. Or here's one way to look at it. All right, there are a lot of things that we carry with us, right? We carry a lot of things, a lot of material objects. So right here, I have my phone, right? Everyone has their phone, or everyone has a wallet, whatever. It doesn't have to be a wallet, it doesn't have to be a phone. Just something you carry with you on a daily. Now, imagine if you just carried your anxiety just like you carry your phone, right? It's there, you know it's there, but it's not affecting you in any way. Excuse me. It's just there. It's there with you. It's not going away. You bring it with you. You can look at it if you want. You can sit with it. You can just be there with it in a non-judgmental way, right? So what am I advocating for, right? So I'm sorry, let me go back. It doesn't affect you. You can still move on with your life and you can do the things that are meaningful to you, right? Because typically some anxieties, right? It could be so pathological for some people. And I mean pathological where it can be just maladaptive, right? In the way that it affects their daily life where they can't. So maybe someone who has, anxiety talking with people, or what they call social anxiety, right? They want to have, that person who's suffering from social anxiety wants friends. They want to go out. But what ends up happening is that they, seclude themselves in their home, right? So you have something that has become pathological, that is affecting their values, that is affecting the things that help them or want to live a meaningful life. Now imagine if that person just carried around anxiety, right? Just like you carry your phone in your pocket, right? They're not trying to control the experience. They're not trying to control the content of the experience. What they're trying to do is, or what they can do is respond to it in a way where they're not going to judge it. They're just going to be with it. And studies have found, right, that this is way more helpful than the traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, right? I don't know if I have anything else to say with that.
So it's like redirecting all of the brain patterns to be focused on something else.
His pain thing, yeah, again, like I said, part of the problem, right, is experiential avoidance. He is avoiding his experience, trying to control the experience, and he's causing himself pain, right? But this is only going to, I feel like this is research right here, that the more you try to control a particular thing, the more it actually becomes a problem, right? So for example, the more you try to control obsessive thoughts or try to control certain thoughts, the more you actually are likely to have thoughts that are intrusive, that are obsessive. So ironically, even though it sounds like he says it's helping, it probably does in the short term. He's sacrificing short-term gain for long-term gain. Sorry, short-term gain for long-term gain, right?
Same kind of thing that if you, as you said, if you could just spend 5-10 minutes focusing really intently on something else, it's the same kind of idea. But I just noticed that for me personally, causing myself physical pain is like the easiest way to snap my brain out of it and get out of this anxiety loop. But are there any other practical ways that you have?
Yeah, practical way, maybe just not doing anything and just sitting with the experience and not judging it. Have you tried that? Maybe we should try that and see how that goes, right? So I've had experience with something like this too. Let me just give a more of a real example, I guess, that's non-anxiety related. So I've had a lot of, growing up, I didn't have the best relationship with my family. I won't name any names because obviously this is public. But what I noticed is that with this individual, whenever I had a positive time, quality time or individual time or just, quality time with an individual, it would always go downhill, right? It would always be a problem. Always, always, always come to a problem. I would end up upset, I'd end up crying, and something would end up happening pretty bad. Nothing like abuse in that way, but just like it just became a bad experience, right? And so now that I'm older and now I'm in a position to where I have children, when I remember my wife was leaving for the first time, leaving like out of town for the first time for a couple of days, and I was just going to have our daughter. I found myself having these intrusive thoughts or having thoughts that I didn't want. It was unpleasant where I was thinking that I'm going to mess this up. I'm going to mess up our time. I'm going to say something. I'm going to do something where she's going to cry. She's going to be upset. She's going to do X, Y. I'm going to do something. I'm going to mess it up. Okay. I remember talking to my therapist about this too. And she offered me pretty good advice, or not in the sense of like a restructuring, right? Or in a way to combat my thoughts, be like, well, where's the evidence? And because I tried to, I'm like, well, she hasn't done this yet. She's laughing, she's having a good time. And I'm telling my therapist this, but yet there's something on the back of my mind that's still not convinced that I'm going to mess it up. Well, it turns out that I don't have these thoughts anymore because over time, I've just have learned, that I'm not going to do that. And if I do happen to do those things, I do happen to say the wrong thing or get in trouble or something, or not. Sorry. I do happen to do those things. I do mess up the time. It's not ruined, quote unquote. But what I end up doing is, I'll go to my daughter or my son. Well, not my son, but my daughter right now, and apologize for either what I said or something like that. But I've gotten very good at just living with the experience, right? I'm not letting. So here's what I'm trying to say. Let me back up. I had the experience of intrusive thoughts. It was very unpleasant. What I could have done, right? I could have just put her on the iPad or put her on the TV and never engaged with her, because if I did that, I would never mess up the time. I didn't do that because I don't want to do that. I want to have a relationship with my daughter. I want to engage with her. I want to be with her. I want to have a meaningful relationship with her. So there's the value, right? That's the value. So the value is I want to be the best parent that I can to my daughter. I could have just put her on the iPad and avoided the experience of me messing up, right? The thoughts that were telling me I'm going to mess up. I could have done that and I didn't. What I decided to do was just to have the experience, be with the experience, not judge the experience, and just enjoy my time or just play with her and see what happens. And the more I did that, and the more I continued to do that, the more I found that I genuinely don't mess up. I actually have a really pleasant time with her to where, we have a great time playing with her Barbies or whatever the case, whatever she wants to do. We have a good time together. That is a way of how using ACT, right? Using acceptance commitment therapy can help someone live a more meaningful life. Now, notice though, I didn't combat in that, going back to the experience, I wasn't combating the content of my experience. I wasn't trying to argue with myself. All I did was I had the thoughts. I continued to be and play with her. And then what ended up happening? I never messed up. I never did that. But I still had the thoughts. I still have those thoughts. It's not like they've just magically gone away. I still have those thoughts from time to time, but they don't have the same, what we're going to call function, over my behavior, right? So that's something how I want you guys to think about. And I would want you to think about it in this way, where it's, this is a different approach.
Have come across or read about, or what's kind of worked for you to kind of snap yourself out of it?
Well, I think you do whatever works, unless you're engaged in significant self harm like cutting, and that's of course.
Right.
So I think I don't necessarily disagree with you do what works. I mean, so there's a philosophy in behavior analysis that's called functional contextualism, which is, as long as you have your values, right? We're going to look at it in a way that is that effective or is that not effective, right? Is that effective? Is what you're thinking currently right now, is that an effective way to get to your goal? Or is that not an effective way? And if it's not an effective way, then let's do something about it. Let's change it, right? So, and it's very broad, but Dr. Moreland, JP Moreland, he does put the caveat to if you're engaging in significant self-harm. I definitely think there are better ways to, I would say there's definitely better ways for Cameron to deal with his experience of anxiety rather than hurting himself. That's what I will say.
But what you're doing is not even close to that. So my advice is that the thing that you don't want to do is to continue to obsess on it, and before you're powerless to stop.
He says you don't want to continue to obsess about it, but then he also said earlier that you can't just will yourself through sheer will to stop obsessing about something. So, I mean, like here, I'm stopping to obsess about it. Like, it doesn't work that way, right?
And that's the loop you're talking about. And so I'm going to reiterate, step one is asking God and then focusing your attention on helping you to become more aware of when you're triggered.
Okay, we're also on the 20-minute mark. Cameron has asked JP Moreland multiple times, how to help combat this, strategies, X, Y, and Z. I still have yet to have JP Moreland say, go see a counselor, go see a professional. I do find that problematic, even from a Christian perspective, because you can see a Christian counselor. You can do that. They are out there. So that's kind of just a note and a slight frustration.
And the thing that's triggering it. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy, I think, is probably one of the best forms of therapy for anxiety.
I mean, I don't know. I'm going to probably dispute that and say ACT is probably a better form of cognitive behavioral therapy. Although a cognitive behavioral therapist can still use acceptance commitment therapy type of strategies. So I'm going to say ACT is better. I'll see. That's my bias. But yeah.
In the early stages. What I mean by that is that in cognitive behavioral therapy, you, as C.S. Lewis put it, doubt your doubts. You make a case for why this is.
Okay, so that's not. It kind of makes me wonder if JP Moreland has done. I'm assuming he has. All right, I'm just going to go on that assumption. I'm going to assume he has done cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm just going to call it CBT for short. You don't necessarily doubt your doubts. I think that's just a very. I don't want to say ignorant. Maybe I do. At worst, ignorant. At best, just misguided. You're not necessarily doubting your doubts. Although cognitive behavioral therapists will, in some sense, focus on the content, right? They're going to focus on the content of your thought patterns. And that's why they've labeled things, certain thought patterns, cognitive distortions, because they're distorting your perspective of the world. So they are focusing on content, but they're not going to sit there and argue with a client, right? They may ask the client, why do you think that? And have the client start engaging in certain thoughts to where, here's an example where I had a hard time. I don't know if I have this problem necessarily anymore because now I kind of just do it. And I just do it because, I care about my wife, but I have a hard time helping people personally. I have a hard time helping people that can just do things themselves, right? So I'll make myself again vulnerable. I have a hard time doing that. So my wife has asked for help a lot, and especially I was having a problem with that because I was like, why can't you just do it, And I remember talking to my therapist about this, and she just straight up asked me, why can't you? So I was telling her, like, thinking that I'm totally right here. I'm thinking like, you know what? Like, yeah, she can just do it. I don't know why I need to help her all the time, especially if she doesn't need help. She's just constantly at, X, Y, and Z. My therapist just straight up asked me, why can't you just help her? Right. So here's something that's going to be some type of CBT type of way. She's going to challenge what I think, right? She's challenging what I'm thinking or how I'm thinking about these things. Right. And the fact of the matter is I sat there and thought, why can't I just help her? And then that actually led to another conversation about something else, right? Things about myself personally, right? It led into that conversation. But all I'm saying is that it's not very, I think it's maybe superficial, maybe that's the right word, to say that you're just doubting your doubts. That's not necessarily true. Although the CBT is gonna be more focused on the content.
Worth worrying about. That this isn't gonna happen. This is a stupid thing. It's got nothing to do with reality. If it does happen, I'll figure it out. I don't need to think about it today. uh, and that sort of thing. Now, I think that what that does then is that gives you a little bit of, it kind of takes the power out of the thing you're anxious about by sort of giving yourself some reasons not to think it's going to happen or it's that big a deal. Now, at that point, then you engage in a different behavior, like a refocusing your attention or doing what you're doing or something that causes you to have to redirect what you're aware of to something else so that you're not mulling over the triggering worry. And I think, though, that if you're dealing with a trigger that is habitual, and it's something that you have discovered you go to regularly, then I think the cognitive behavioral therapy at that point is not helpful because you don't want to get down in the mud and argue with this again because that's just going to dig the grooves deeper. So my view is that cognitive behavioral therapy is good in the early stages of finding out something and trying to kind of neutralize it. But after a while, and I don't know when that point is reached, but it becomes counterproductive to come up with all the reasons again why this can't happen or why.
That's because I think this kind of tells me where a little bit where I think JP Moreland just has a very superficial view of cognitive behavioral therapy. Nowhere is the therapist just going to continue to sit there and argue or have their client continue there just to argue about X, Y, and Z or whatever their thought patterns are. There is way more to cognitive behavioral therapy than there is. Sometimes cognitive behavioral therapists will recommend strategies like writing down things in a journal, write down your notes. Maybe they'll do labeling as that. What JP Moreland has said, maybe they will help the client label. They're going to help the client dig deeper into themselves. And what they're going to do generally is do some type of exposure therapy, right? So they're going to, through imagination, in a very safe therapeutic environment. So, in the client, and sorry, not the clients, but in the office of the therapist, perhaps, and do some type of exposure therapy where they're going to talk about it, or they may have that. Maybe it's a fear of something. They'll have the client do something, engage in something that's going to evoke the feelings of fear or anxiety and help the client work through it. So it's very superficial for JP Moreland just to say, well, you don't want to sit there and just have these arguments with these other arguments because then now you're just going back into the rut. Well, what? Who's going to do that? I would like to know which kind of psychotherapist would do something like that, or wouldn't adjust or change their strategy. So seems very, at worst, it seems ignorant. At best, it's just superficial.
It does happen. It's not the end of the world because what you're really doing is you're just spending time obsessing on it again. And you pass over from a helpful way of doubting the problem to an obsession. And at that point, I think what you have to do, like I state in the book, are just some refocusing that doesn't involve
the strategies that he lists in the book. I have not read the book, but if he does the strategies, which it sounds like he does, a cognitive behavioral therapist would use those same strategies. There's nothing incompatible about CBT with that.
Countering it like what you're doing. So I think that I'm not trying to sell my book, Finding Quiet. I don't care.
Yeah.
In research is that if a person's in the hospital and they're in some kind of pain, if they can simply give a name to what that is, if the doctor can say, this is what
talk about labeling a little bit more. We're coming into, let's see, an hour and 20 minutes. I don't know how much longer I want to keep going. Let's see.
Depression from a Christian perspective. We'll get to that in just a little bit. But I wanted to return to this idea that anxiety is basically enemies with reason. And I've noticed that in my own experience, all of the things that I've been worried about health-wise have turned out to be false. And I think a lot of times when especially if you deal with anxiety with relation to apologetics or philosophy or these sort of super metaphysical truths about the world or worldview questions.
Metaphysical truths about the world is causing you anxiety. That's a new one for me. Sorry, I'm not trying to downplay anyone's experience if they're actually having experience of that. That's new to me.
Anxiety about that. I've had multiple people reach out to me personally and say, hey, look, I deal with this all the time. It's super bad. And one of the things that I tell them is, okay, first of all, the first thing you need to do is get your anxiety under control. So if apologetic.
There we go. Here's another theme in the view, right? Control, overcome, symptoms, avoidance. Those are the themes of this conversation right now. A little bit of the themes.
Is your trigger. Then, because I think the reason why we don't want to recognize apologetics or philosophy or some of these big questions as like a trigger for anxiety is because if they're true, then that's a good thing. And so that can sometimes get in the way of you actually getting better anxiety-wise. So what I always recommend is if you're in an anxiety rut right now, then what you need to do is get your anxiety under control, and I think you said something similar earlier on, and then once you get your anxiety under control, then you can return to these questions in a very, The
thing is, a little bit, what needs to be controlled, right? You're trying to control the experience. Is it, and this is what is just a misunderstanding about human psychology, right? You can't control the experience, right? here's an example, right? Just look at Cameron's hat right now. By the way, Christianity is true. What is that? Like, we're just reading words, right? That form a statement. Now, that doesn't evoke any emotion within me at all. I can say, oh my gosh, if it's true, I'm going to go to hell. I don't have those feelings. I can't just will myself to have that experience. Likewise, if Christianity is true and heaven is true, and then there is a heaven, right? That doesn't give me a bunch of joy right now. So what is it about? What is the relationship between the way we're using language and our psychological experiences? Which is why I think this is a misguided view a little bit, where if you want to say that anxiety, the content, right, it is what should be focused on rather than the experience itself, right? I think that it needs to be where someone can use language as a way to escape, right? Obviously, it's not true, right? So here's and sometimes it could be true, but what they're really trying to do, or what they're doing, is trying to escape. They're using language to escape the experience, not actually use language to form these cognitive, rational beliefs about something.
Mindset, so that you're not being swayed by your emotions. And again,
so there you go. And that's another thing too that I think is just fundamentally misunderstanding about what Cameron thinks about the role of emotions. I do think, he hasn't really said it in this video yet, but I think he has a view of emotion that if you are emotions, or if you're basing things off an emotion, it's either unjustified or that's just an irrational process, which I don't think is true, right? I was talking to a philosopher friend of mine where I asked him this very question, something related to Cameron, and about Cameron, I should say, and what he thought about the role of emotions and how do they affect us and things like that. And his view, he said that we're integrated beings, right? We have emotions, we make judgments off of our emotions, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily unsound, right? And I can give some examples, but let me just get through this a little bit more, and I can maybe flesh this out a little bit, what I mean by that.
That's important, because you've got to recognize that anxiety is not rational. Anxiety is typically irrational. And so
anxiety is typically irrational. Citation needed for that. This is just based off of Cameron's own introspection, because he's had an experience with it. But that's also the problem. And again, you haven't really defined anxiety. We're 28 minutes into this. He still has not defined anxiety. Anxiety is future-oriented, and in fact, it is highly adaptive. When does it become non-adaptive anymore? Well, it becomes non-adaptive when you're having anxiety things or triggers when something needs to be controlled or something like that.
Led by your anxiety in the field of apologetics, in the field of philosophy, then you're going down all sorts of weird, wacky paths. It doesn't have to do, may not have anything to do with reason, even though it feels like it is. And so I think that.
Okay, sorry, my dog is barking. It's bothering me.
Is just a really important point, something to point out, is that apologetics, philosophy, those can be triggers, but what you need to do is you need to get healthy.
Okay, what am I going to do? Let me do this real quick. Let me mute my. Okay,
get healthy, and then
I am back.
To these questions, I think that's important. Some people just don't want to do that because they think that apologetics, philosophy is so important, which they are. But again, you've got to get healthy, and then I think it's good to return to these things. What comments do you have on that?
Well, you're absolutely right. Our focusing of worry on this specific apologetic problem, and oh my gosh, what if we're wrong on this, can be a way of coping with. This is an issue. You don't know what to do with it. Just relax for a minute. Somebody's answered it. I mean, you're not alone. You're in a body. This is covered, and you can probably realize that's true. But what you don't want to do is to follow.
So I'm just going to skip through some of this stuff since we're coming close to an hour and a half, and I probably should get going soon.
If the activity is making you more anxious, that's the time when, as you pointed out, Cameron, you need to take a vacation from it, and you got to put it down on paper.
I feel like I've said enough about anxiety and our responses to it, so I don't want to keep reiterating my stuff.
Or so, and it ought to be capable. with your emotions, like you're pointing out, and like I've written about with what you're talking about.
So let's turn to some of the specific things about Christianity. How can Christianity in particular help our anxiety and help us overcome depression? Again, anxiety is not rational. You think it is, but it's not. Okay, that aside.
All right, what did he say? What kind of
whoever that you use in order to battle your anxiety. And if you don't have someone that's in your corner and helping you out, then I highly suggest that you do that. Like, don't rely on yourself. That's one of the things that anxiety and depression does, is it makes you feel like you're isolated, alone, like no one else is going to understand. But that's all false. It's all lies. Again, anxiety is not rational. You think it is, but it's not. Okay,
Those are some pretty good bold assertions there with some confidence. You know, I guess if you say some things with confidence, then, you know, maybe they're more believable. But I mean, obviously, I come from a different perspective. It's not a cognitive process. It's a psychological or non-cognitive process. So it's just kind of bizarre that he put this in this category.
In the book, one of the things, it's just so, I mean, it's like one of the most obvious verses. I mean, growing up a Christian, I heard this verse 1,000 times, in particular, to help overcome.
Cameron, you don't need to plan for the future. No, you know, if I got something to do Wednesday, a talk I have to give, well, I might have to start working on it on Monday. So that's sensible. But I'm talking about living in that speech and worrying about giving it right now.
Yeah, so there we go. We kind of getting a little bit into the future, future-oriented version of what anxiety is, you know?
That's not helpful. So what I began to do is
okay, let's just keep going.
With or whatever it might be that I'm doing.
Ooh, we got an ad. First time.
50 times more earwax than cotton swabs and lasts a lifetime.
Weeks, and I said, you know, honey, I don't have any idea. You're as messed up as I am. That's the point. But I don't spend time thinking about it, and so my wife no longer asks me, "What do you have going this week?" Or because I tell her surgeries were, because I knew they were down the road, and because you're going to have to pinch yourself a lot. But
oh yeah, this was a really, really bad joke.
So you see, you have to unhabituate living in the future and habituate living in the present, and you do that by noticing times when you go to the future and refusing to go there and refocusing. You know, you're going to have bruises on your arm because you're going to have to pinch yourself a lot. But after you get in the habit, you know, you can tell people maybe your wife's beating you. That might be.
Yeah, that's a really bad joke.
Well, you know,
people get abused all the time. Really, really bad joke.
By the end of the interview here, 2 more things I want to cover, and then we'll get to some questions. So the first thing is that is Christian teaching
our soul, and conversely, the way God intended you to create those chemicals. Well, these are ways of.
A few different things myself. Well, first, are you still on any medications for anxiety?
Yeah, maintenance dosage.
Oh, this one they talk about a little bit of medications. I mean, I have my opinions on medication. I'm not a professional, so when it comes to medication or psychiatrist, so I mean, if you're going to take medication, that's between you and your medical doctor.
Yeah, I tried to go off of them, and it was
on my own, and just trying different, basically just changing my behaviors. And once I realized that I was basically going on autopilot, and I was allowing myself to get in these ruts, get on the anxiety train, and just like not getting out. And once I realized that I could actually do things to stop that, and once I started to do those, I started to recognize, and that's not a complete cure. I still, every now and then, I get in these ruts of anxiety, and I have to kind of refresh myself on all the different things that work and help, and recentering myself and back, and just realizing that God exists. He loves us with unconditional love, and so like even if some bad thing happens, He's still going to love us unconditionally. It's just an amazing world that we live in, really, honestly.
It really is. And I'd add one thing, and we'll move on. I would, if you think you would like to try medications, go to a psychiatrist, not your GP.
All right, maybe we get through some questions.
Do you have any time to go past the hour mark for questions?
A little bit. Yeah.
All right, let's see what other questions are there.
Type of meditation. So why don't you go into that a little bit and maybe explain some of the practices that you've used in your life to.
Okay, that's just what he talks about.
Your attention, if you get distracted. So,
okay, so Eric Hernandez says, I know someone who needs to read your book, but they feel their case is hopeless and won't read it. Advice, you bless my soul.
Alternative way. The other thing you could do would be to take something in the book and go talk to this person and share it directly with them, and maybe take a little one-page handout on something. So, you know, like the 10 thought disorders. So you might be able to accomplish it through direct discussion.
I don't know, that's a tough one because you may be crossing boundaries. You know, you can't help someone that doesn't want to be helped. And it's very difficult to see a loved one, you know, that needs help, doesn't want the help. So I don't know. It's kind of hard. I don't have a clear answer on that. Other than just offering suggestions or advice or, you know, making sure that you're there to support them. I think that's probably the best thing, that it's like, hey, you know what? I know you may not want the help, whatever, but if you need help or support, you know, I'm always there for you. Something like that. Make sure that they're loved. Because, I mean, it could work, it could backfire when you're trying to feel like they're being forced into something that they don't want to do. It's very hard.
The other thing is,
Okay, let's see what other questions that may be there. I'm sorry, I'm just skipping through all this stuff because I don't. Oh, I think Cameron says some things here. I always want to listen to what Cameron says.
On that was again, this all goes back to like anxiety is irrational. So how can we start to replace some of those bad behaviors with rational behaviors? And so what I started to do was rely on experts. So if I had a serious symptom I was experiencing, instead of going to Google and doing the irrational thing of going down the list of what it could be on in a Google search, I did the rational thing by going to a doctor, talking to an expert, and getting an expert opinion, as opposed to like just whatever I could find on Google. And I think that can also apply in the field of apologetics. So if you're
Okay. Let's see. Super chat. Is it possible to actually learn to cherish these imperfections as designed? I'm thinking of Paul and Annie Flint. I don't know who Paul or Annie Flint are. Is it possible to actually learn to cherish these imperfections? I don't know. I don't really have a thought on this. I mean, like I said, I'm going to look at it from a different lens. I think if we can learn to have our experiences and not let our experiences get in the way of living a meaningful life, I think that's kind of the way we should go about doing things. But it starts by, I think in some sense, it starts by trying not to control the experience and just be there with the experience and not judge it, right? Not make an evaluation of it. Yeah.
They're inherent evils.
I mean, but this is going to be filtered in through. This is more for JP Morley since he's coming from a Christian perspective. So I don't necessarily care. Let me see what this question is. Wife who's 34 never has any anxiety up until 3 months. Scary stuff. Just creeped in for absolutely no reason. Yeah. Let me see. What did they say about that?
Thoughts or comments? Maybe some advice for Ryan, who seems just using context clues here. Seems like Ryan may not suffer from anxiety himself, but maybe some thoughts on how Ryan can help his wife out here.
Well, I think Ryan.
Maybe offer talk about going to a counselor. I mean, if it's his wife, it's very hard. Never had anxiety up until 3 months. Maybe something triggered it for some reason. I don't really care to comment on that. Let me see what this one says. My anxiety contributes strongly to what if doubts. What if Christianity is not true? What if doubts seem to be immune to apologetics? There is always a what if lingering in the back of my head. Hey, this was really helpful. I used to suffer from anxiety and depression, but the Lord has delivered me from most of the anxiety still shows up. That's interesting. He used to suffer from it, but the Lord has delivered it from him. Most of it. There we go. It still shows up when I try sharing my faith. Huh. Maybe there's some type of... never mind. I don't want to comment on that because I have no idea his experience. Advice for Christians who have loved ones who suffer from depression or have lost on... Okay. I think that's all I wanted to talk about. There was another video that I was going to talk about, but then, I ended up going up close to an hour and a half, so I don't really want to talk about it. I'm kind of done talking about this topic. I guess conclusions is, like I said, throughout the whole video, they never really clearly identified or talked about what anxiety is. I find that problematic just because, for the same reasons that I've said before, is that it's hard to really know what they're talking about. It's used very loosely and in different contexts, so it's very hard. I do find it problematic that Cameron wants to continually try to pit anxiety against, as a non-rational, as an irrational process, when it's actually not an irrational process. It's more of a psychological process, a psychological experience, which are by themselves probably more non-cognitive. So it's not going to have any truth value to it. It's just going to be there. And just because he's using language doesn't mean that he's actually forming beliefs about things, it could be the case. I don't know. All I know is that there is language that is being used and it is involved just like in any other thing because we have language. All right. That's one of our abilities that we have that distinguishes us between, non-human animals. And the way that language is used can evoke feelings of anxiety, such as future-based content. Right. And the problem is the problem, I should say, with contemporary, I guess, mainstream cognitive behavioral therapy is that it is very content focused. Right. And ACT, acceptance as commitment therapy or from a behavioral perspective, we're not going to focus on the content. We're going to want to focus on the actual experience and learning to quote unquote accept the experience, right? And that means, it doesn't mean giving up. It doesn't mean giving in. It means sitting with having an experience and non-judging it, not making an evaluation of that. And it's very, very hard to do, right? We have the role of language that is there, right? Just imagine, just try yourselves. I encourage everyone here, go when you're driving, if you have road rage, imagine having the experience of anger and not having thoughts come about it, right? Imagine, having pain, right? You hurt yourself or something and not judging that experience instead of just feeling the pain, right? We're not trained to do these things. We're trained, if anything, we've been conditioned and socialized to have evaluations of these thoughts, right? To combat these thoughts, to argue with these thoughts. We're not trained to accept the thoughts, right? What I mean by acceptance is non-judging these thoughts, non-evaluating these thoughts, non-evaluating the experience, I should say, not the thoughts, non-evaluating the experience, right? It's very, very hard to do. The thing is, though, there are times, I'm not saying you need to do this throughout your life. That would be kind of taking the rule, right? The rule-governed behavior aspect and, overgeneralizing it. There are times when you should listen to your thoughts or listen to the thoughts that come about, and there are times when you shouldn't, right? And then you can look at it again as emotional regulation. There are times when you need to regulate your emotion, and then there are times when you should not regulate your emotion, right? And it's finding, of course, like I'm going to say, probably finding the wisdom, right, to know which is which, right? Or which times to do it and which times not to do it. And that's a very hard thing to do. And that's where you rely on others. You talk to others, you get advice, you get support, you talk to professionals, you do things like that to help you figure out, those things. So I think that's all I have to say. I hope you guys found this valuable, I guess mainly valuable. These were just my thoughts. Again, I'm not diagnosing anyone. I'm not trying to say, what's going on. I'm just taking what was said and, obviously making inferences off those and then offering my own perspective. This is a perspective from more of a behavioral psychological perspective. It is not from a clinical psychologist. I am not a psychologist. I cannot diagnose anyone like that. I am just strictly talking about things that were said and things that I see that are talked about behaviorally. So yeah, hope you guys found that enjoyable. All right, take care.